Right. So next, now we'll be discussing throw. We have discussed in the previous explanation. Now I'll be talking about throws class. How throws class will be useful. Throws block is used. That is, if there is a method which can cause some type of error, which it cannot handle. There is some method which it cannot handle some type of exception, and it should specify or it should indicate that to the other users so that other users can be careful while calling that particular method. That is how the throws clause is useful. That is how the throws clause is useful. Say for example, I'll take the diagram to explain this. There is a method and there is a caller, caller number one or caller number two. There is a method and which can throw one type of exception. Which throws what type of exception? Say for example, division by zero error. It is causing the error called division by zero. It is a method which is capable of throwing the error division by zero error, but it cannot handle. But it don't have solution. But it don't have solution. Which method? This method. If caller one wants to call this particular method or make use of this particular method, he must be made aware about that fact well in advance. This method should tell to all the users saying that I will throw the exception called division by zero error, and for that I don't have any solution. It will advertise itself so that the callers can know about that particular problem well in advance, so that they can have the solution for that. So they will know, yes, anyhow if I call this method, there are possibilities that division by zero error will be there, but still they can call. If the caller 2 wants, he knows that what he knows, method 2 can cause the division by zero error. If he wants, he calls that method, else he may not call that method. So ultimately what should happen here is the method can advertise saying that it throws some exception. It throws some exception. So how it can advertise? It can advertise that by using the throws class. It can advertise that by using the throws class. Now before that, let us see what happens if a method cannot advertise. First, let us see the problem in this program. So what is the throws clause? When the throws clause will be used, a method can advertise to the caller saying that it will throw so and so error. So be careful before calling that particular method. But before this solution, let us see the problem first. So this is one program in which what is happening here is throw one method is being called, and throw one method is what throw one method is doing. Throw one method is throwing one new exception. What is that exception? Illegal access exception. It is throwing one exception, but there is no corresponding cache block for that. There is no corresponding cache block for that. So here the program execution will stop abruptly. Here the program execution will stop abruptly. That is, throws clause in the method declaration can be used to define that throws exception. The method can throw the particular type of exception. That is what type of exception that a method can throw. So its general syntax is just name of the method, parameter method, throws followed by the exception list. So this is the method what I just shown here, the same method. Here there is an exception whenever throw one method is being called, within the body of the throw one method, there is an exception called illegal access exception, which is not being caught, So I'll just demonstrate this program and I'll show you. That is throws demo one. What happens if the exception is not being caught? Java C throws demo one. Yes, as you can see, there is an unreported exception. What is that? Illegal access exception must be caught or declared to be thrown. Two things you have to do. Either you should write a catch block for that, or you should make use of the throws clause. Both we have not done. So that's why it is throwing an error. So what is the solution for that? The solution for this is make use of the within the throw one method. You have to make use of the throws clause. Yes, that same program is modified here. I'll take help here. The same, this program is throwing error. Why? Because there is no catch clause or there is no advertisement also. Now this is the modified method. So what is happening in this modified method? We are calling the throw one method now, that is kept within the try block, and the corresponding catch block is also written now. The corresponding catch block is also written now. So whenever you call the throw one method, so here clearly we are declaring what is that? Throw one throws illegal access exception. It is throwing illegal access exception, and this statement will be printed as it is. And later, whenever you throw the illegal access exception, that can be handled by this particular catch block. Why? Because now for this throw one method, we have written the corresponding catch block, and the program will work now without any issues. Program will work now without any specific issues. So that is how the throws clause will be used. It is used to advertise to the callers that so such and such error can occur and just guard yourself. Right? The same program is modified. The modified program I'll show now. Throws demo 2. Throws demo 2.java. 1 second. Throws demo 2.java. This compilation is successful. Why? Because there are no issues with the runtime. Java throws demo 2. Yes, inside throw one and we have successfully caught the exception, and the program will not stop abruptly. We are able to solve the exception now. Right. Next, let us see the last clause called finally clause. So what finally block? Finally is a some sort of block which will always execute after completion of all the try and catch blocks. Finally block will always execute after completion of all the try and catch blocks, whether there is an exception or not. If there is an exception, solve that exception, then execute the finally block. If there is no exception, then also finally block will execute. If there is an exception, but it is not solved by the catch block, then also the finally block will execute. So ultimately what finally block is, it is a set of statements which will be executed at the end of all the try and catch blocks. At the end of all the try and catch blocks. So if you remember the syntax in the beginning, whatever we discussed, I'll just try to show here. Yes, see here, this was the earlier syntax what we have saw. Try block, catch block, and we have finally block. This is just a block of code that will be executed after the termination of all the try blocks, after all the try and catch blocks ends. So how the finally works? How the finally works? Assume there is a try block, catch block, then finally it will work. It will work in this way. If there is a try block, if there is an exception, then solve that exception in the catch block, then execute the finally block. Then we have a try block, no corresponding catch block, then also finally will work. Then also finally will work. That means there is an exception, there is no catch block, then also the finally will work. Now try and catch, no exception. When there is no exception also, then also finally will work. So I hope you are understanding what is finally block. Finally block is something which will execute at any point of time, whether there is an error or not, whether there is an exception handler or not, whether the catch block is executing or not, whether the try block is executing or not. Finally block will execute at any given point of time. So why finally block is used usually? To release the resources being held by the programs. That means, say for example, printer. If there is a printer which is being held by some program, and if you want to make sure that before the whenever the program stops execution or the program terminates, you have to take away that particular printer. So that particular code you can write within the finally block. That means whatever the things you should do at the end of execution, all those will be written within the finally block. That is any set of code you can write within the finally block. So this is one class process A. Totally, there are processes we are using in this process A, process B, and process C. Three processes are being called. So what happens here is process A is being executed. That is method A is being executed. Try block for that and corresponding finally block. Try block and corresponding finally block. That means in the try, if you are throwing this exception once again, this will be printed, then exception will be thrown before the control goes back, then finally will be executed. That is whatever you do, the finally will execute. Process A is finally will execute. Then similarly for process B, inside process will be printed and simply we are returning. But before you return to the caller, process B is finally will be executed, because there is no exception here. Even if there is no exception here, this will execute. This statement will execute because that is processed in the written in the finally block. Now similarly process C. Inside process C, this statement will be executed as it is. And this statement also will be executed. Why? Because it is part of the finally block. Whatever is written in the finally block, that will be executed ultimately. That will be executed ultimately. See here, whenever the program execution starts from the main function, first process A is being called. Now let us take the control to process A. Control gets transferred to the definition of the process A. Yes, let's go to the definition of process A. So process A, within process A, what is happening? Output, what it will print? It will print inside process A. It will print inside process A. Then again the exception is being thrown. Again the exception is being thrown. Before that exception is thrown back to the method, this will be printed. What is that? Process A is finally. One second. I'll write it completely. Here I have output. I'll just copy it. Control C. Right? What I was explaining, yes, inside process A will be executed first. Inside process A will be executed. Then that exception is thrown again. Throw new one exception once again. Then execute process A is finally. Before you go back, this process A will execute at any cost. It will not be skipped. That this block will not be skipped, and we will get an output called process A is finally. I'll explain it and show the demonstration afterward. Then once that exception is thrown again here, that is caught within the corresponding cache block, because this within this method we had an exception, and that is caught within this particular block. So what it will print? It will print simply a statement saying that exception is caught. Then we will call process B, then we'll call process C. So when you call process B, what happens? B and C, they are not causing any exception. In process B, what happens? It will simply print inside process B is finally. Similarly, process C, what it does? Inside process C is finally. So that is how the finally block works. Whatever, whether there is an exception or not, the finally block will execute. The finally block will execute. Finally demo. Java. Yes. Inside process A is finally exception caught. So here, whenever process A is executing, what will get printed first? Inside process A. That is what is the option to show it. Yes. First, what we print when calling the method from the main function, what we are trying to call here is right. First, what happens whenever we call method A from the main function, we are invoking the process within the try block. We are calling process A. That means now control will go to the definition of process A. Control will go to the definition of process A. Here we have process A, and within process A we have try block. This statement will execute as it is. What is that? Inside process A. So inside process A, then we are throwing an exception once again. So you need to concentrate here. What is that? Here we are throwing an exception once again. That means it should be thrown back to the caller, whoever has called. From where we got this call? From try block within the main function. Before you return to this, you execute this finally. What is that? Finally of process A or finally of process A must be executed. That means process A is finally. Next statement is process A is finally. Then exception will be caught within the main function. Then exception will be caught within the main function. So we have received that exception. Then exception caught statement will execute. So in between the exception, before you rethrow the exception, we have executed the statement called process is finally. That means whatever may be the case, the finally block will execute. Next, let us call the process B. The control will get transferred to process B. If you look at the definition of the process B, within the try block, what happens? Inside process B will execute. Now there is no catch block or there is no exception. That means simply you have to return back to the caller now. Simply you have to return back to the caller after printing this. But before you return, this finally block will execute. Because the purpose of finally block is whether there is an exception or not, all the statements written within the finally block will execute. So what is the output? Process B is finally. Similarly, once you return, what happens? What is the next statement? We are calling the method C or process C now. Control will get transferred to process C. Definition of process C. Yes, as you can see, definition of process C. Inside process C will be printed, and usually you have to go back to the caller. But before you return to the caller, what we do? Process C finally will be printed. Why? Because it is part of the finally block. So inside process C, then process C is finally. So ultimately, what finally block is? It contains set of statements which will be executed whether there is an exception or not. At any given point of time, if there is an exception, solve it, then execute the finally block. If there is no exception, then also execute the finally block. This is what you should remember about the finally block.